This is Mary Owens with Owens Estate and Wealth Strategies Group. We are in Chinatown in San Francisco, and we're going to be exploring the economic and political issues surrounding China. And we are welcoming Professor David Rowland Host from UC Berkeley, the expert on the west coast of the United States on all things related to China. Thank you, David. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and your involvement with China?
Thank you, Mary. I'm delighted to talk about this very important topic today. I've been working on China since 1989. I'm almost ashamed to admit it now. It's been quite a while, but I've seen this transition, a remarkable change for a country going essentially from a Stalinist backwater to being the largest or the second largest economy in the world.
If we can start today with a broad-based economic outlook right now, what is currently happening in China. In particular, I'd like to focus and discuss the issues of China's attempt to move from a manufacturing, export-driven economy to an internal-driven service and consumerism economy. How is the Chinese government right now scoring on their success ratio in this very difficult transition?
You've really put your finger on the most important aspect of China's current economic situation. They're going through a very substantial transition, and it's a structural transition, just as you suggest. China is trying to reduce its relative dependence on exports, external demand, because it can't control that. So it would prefer to have internal demand as the main driver of growth. It's also trying to reduce dependence on investment, which as an indicator of GDP growth has got to come down in order to reduce the momentum of building out capacity for the Chinese economy. As you know, investment is a commitment to future demand, and it's not clear that the demand is going to be there. So this involves a structural rotation in the economy away from external demand and investment demand towards consumer spending. China is trying to essentially build the center of society with a middle class that can sustain long-term growth in the way that it does in the Western industrialized countries.
In the prior economy, the last 10 to 15 years of China, they have been so heavily focused, as you indicated, on the structure of investment, sometimes utilizing in excess of 50% of their GDP as reinvestment back into the economy, which is an extraordinary number. But the structure of how they have been getting that investment dollar. Let's talk a little bit about how China has used the Chinese citizens' savings in creating some of the structural development, in particular in ghost cities, in infrastructure development, water treatment plants, and the like.
The investment boom in China is something without parallel, I think, historically. There's an amazing statistic about just something as mundane as cement. In the last 5 years, China poured more cement than the United States did in the 20th century. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, they built roads
statistic.
Faster than the golden age of the interstate in the United States. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests that this is well ahead of the migration trends, so that there's enormous excess capacity. But to get to your question about the financing of all of that investment, this is something that's coming back to haunt the governments, both at the national and the local level. A lot of this was based on the banking system, which is essentially a captive savings system. Chinese citizens are not allowed to invest in a very diversified set of assets, and particularly they're not allowed to move their money abroad. So they're essentially obliged to keep most of their savings in fixed interest assets in the banking system. Those banks in turn are under tremendous pressure from official institutions to lend preferentially towards these large initiatives because they're politically very important to the national, but especially the local governments. The local governments are all competing for growth. They've created a system where they essentially use their official capacity to appropriate land or join in ventures with local communities, and then they use their relationship with the state-controlled banking system to finance these things. And the basic problem now is there's a tremendous amount of leverage against domestic savings. There are vacancy rates in some areas of over 50% in these residential developments. And these are so-called ghost cities that you're referring to. And there's a tremendous amount of concern. I think the government is resigned to the fact that there's going to have to be a substantial adjustment. They just want to avoid a kind of a crash landing. So they're trying a number of refinancing schemes. You've heard about the bond issues.
Yes.
And what they're doing now is compelling, in areas where there's a local default risk, what they're doing is they're compelling the local authorities to essentially issue local bonds, which are then used to, quote, reimburse the banks, meaning the banks will be holding this paper in lieu of repayment. But of course, the quality of those bonds depends upon their future revenues of the local governments. So they're essentially rolling over these obligations, at least temporarily, to smooth the process.
And that's the concern there is.
Right
now, the local governments get approximately 40% of their revenue from the central government.
That's right.
And the other
That's right.
60%, they have to find some methodology of making up.
That's exactly right. Growth is not uniform across the country, and yet the aspirations of every single municipality are to grow. There's a lot of concern about the viability of this momentum, because the entire reward system of the party is based upon these kinds of economic milestones and growth accomplishments, and so it creates a tremendous bias across the whole country to just push. The party actually is now rewarding other more diverse characteristics of decision making than simply grow. But unfortunately, the legacy of those old hyper-growth strategies is appearing now in the debt obligations that were incurred to finance all this infrastructure.
Yes.
So this was actually, these were decisions that were made from the recession forward, 2008 to about 2012, and now they're coming to haunt the party.
And they have other structural issues related to this enormous debt obligation.
Right.
Let's just assume we take the ghost cities on average and assume that we can get a population level to support the city. So in populating that city, the government still is going to have obligations to come up with money to fund a transportation system, a healthcare system, a police, fire, school, educational system. So the level of debt that they have expended so far still has to increase before they can get to a success ratio to have the economic basin to start to successfully repay it.
The residential infrastructure is only the beginning, because what they're hoping is to create magnets for migration. The problem is that, first of all, there's a mismatch in this real estate market, because most developers are building middle-class, higher-end residential occupancy. Migrants are dirt poor peasants, right?
They're poor.
So not only will they not be occupying those places, but they're not going to contribute that much to the tax base. So it'll be very hard to finance the public goods and services that you're talking about. And the central government, I think, understands they're going to have to help with this process. The biggest concern right now is this problem of heterogeneity. That is, there'll be some success stories, but there are going to be some failures. And the government's got to be very careful about managing that structural adjustment, because they can't possibly reward all of these failures by bailing them out.
To give everyone an idea of the size of this excess capacity, all estimates seem to suggest that the amount of current residential vacancy is in excess of 200 million units.
Right, that's a number that I've seen too, and certainly all the numbers that I find credible are in that range between 150 and 250. And frankly speaking, the migration process has already slowed down in China. So it's like you can rearrange the deck chairs, but you can't get more sailors that are going to swim to the boat.
And in some areas, the migration is starting to reverse.
It absolutely is, yeah, because the cost of living in the urban areas has begun to catch up with wages. Workers are beginning to feel a little bit like they have more choice, and they want to stay closer to home. But basically, we're just getting to the kind of diminishing returns to migration problem, and that means the investment is going to be retargeted towards the interior of China. But of course, all of this has to be demand-driven, and right now that's China's biggest challenge. And they're looking to the consumer, but Chinese consumers they're working pretty hard to spend their money, but it's not clear that they're going fast enough. And that's why we see the GDP estimates, every single revision has been downward. Downward. The international journalistic community in Beijing has a poll that they do of estimates of GDP growth, because this is such a hot topic. They poll brokerages, other wealth management institutions, banks, about their expectations. 4 years ago, this began with 56 members reporting voluntarily, And now it's down to about 22 members reporting their estimates of voluntarily. And the basic conclusion is they don't want to go public because they're too pessimistic and they don't want the Chinese government to be upset. During the stock market downturn, the government was really quite punitive towards anybody who was propagating information that was even skeptical about the upside potential of the market.
It's actually the complete opposite of what China is saying they're trying to do, is slowly go into a free enterprise society that's based on capitalism.
The free enterprise system decentralizes decision making.
Yes.
And it shifts risk taking to markets, and it's significantly outside the control of policymakers. The Chinese government is not used to that. Control is something that's extremely important to them. But this idea of control is really paramount. And that's why when the markets were booming, capitalism was beautiful. But when the markets turned sour, then suddenly it was important to correct the mistakes of the market economy. Let's call it a learning process for the time being. But what the Chinese government has done is put very serious boundaries on the scope of reform. And they've just announced their new reform agenda for state enterprises. And frankly, there's a lot of disappointment about that because they haven't really let go of as much of the public ownership of the economy as outside institutions such as the IMF and banking organizations believe is essential to have more efficient allocation of capital. Across the problem is that the state enterprises have privileged access to the reserve of savings, because as you know, the banking system is still almost 100% state-owned. That's a very important reserve of capital, but for smaller enterprises and especially innovative enterprises, it's very hard to get access.
Now, as far as China's attempt to control the markets and believing they can actually take aspects of capitalism but put on state-run monitors and governors. There's two examples right now that are very glaring. One is the planned devaluation of their currency.
Yes.
And the second is their attempt recently to actually shut down certain stocks trading on their exchange to prevent the fall. Let's start out with the currency issues, because that one has so many impacts, not only in China, but worldwide.
Well, the Chinese currency issue is a very old one, as you know. For many years, China was accused of manipulating its currency because it was basically intervening relatively selectively. There's no direct evidence on this activity, but if you look at the exchange rate over the period that we're talking about, 80s and 90s, this would be an EKG of a patient that's dead on arrival. I mean, basically that exchange rate is just completely flat, or it adjusts in a stepwise fashion. And although we can't get inside and see the central bank's decision making, or even some of its trading, it's pretty clear that this is a product of deliberate policy. The patient became animated when negotiations over the currency became more effective, I would say about 5 to 7 years ago, and the exchange rate began to rise. Now, of course, the objection in the beginning was that keeping the exchange rate down was an unfair competitive advantage for China. It made their goods cheaper for foreigners, and it was seen as essentially not playing fairly. And those objections were quite legitimate. The exchange rate has appreciated pretty substantially. Many experts would argue that it's not that far away from what would be essentially a freely floating rate. But the objection of the government right now is about stability, because they feel that fosters speculation. They're really worried about so-called hot money, that is flows of pure financial assets in and out of the country, and the destabilizing effect of that. And so it's clear that they're still very actively involved in managing their exchange rate. In fairness, again, most major countries do some exchange rate control, manipulation. But in the case of China, they did do a strategic devaluation. That's pretty clear. And it's also pretty clear that was a mistake, in the sense that it had unintended consequences. If the effects of that had been known ahead of time, they wouldn't have done that. And the idea is basically it was a bad habit that they went back to, and that worries people in terms of expectations. That is, how serious is China about market reform? This is the major question. And that particular action in the foreign exchange market challenged their credibility in terms of their commitment. Because they've said, for example, they want the renminbi to be a reserve currency. China's economic scale is appropriate to a reserve currency, but their financial system is not. Because reserve currencies are basically technologies. They're technologies for risk management that are used all over the world. And it's a technology that's adopted voluntarily, and that voluntary adoption is not going to occur simply because the Chinese government wants it to.
As long as there's government intervention, there is a risk that cannot be measured.
That's right. That's
and people will not use it as a reserve currency.
No, that's exactly right. Ironically, the value of a reserve currency is its use for risk management services. And if it's not transparent, then you can't assess the potential risk. Now, the U.S., of course, had a big advantage with the Marshall Plan because they dispersed dollars all over Europe. After the Second World War. And so the dollar became a reserve currency almost by default. But that's history. And that advantage doesn't really exist for China. They're trying to spend a lot of renminbi around the world in development projects, but that's just not on the scale of the Marshall Plan. But there's also this institutional problem, which is that the renminbi doesn't represent a transparent store of wealth because it exists at the pleasure of the Central Bank of China. Ironically, even though they're pushing very hard for reserve currency status, that action actually undermined their...
It set them back almost a decade.
I think China's problem is not really so much the exchange rate management, because they are improving there, but it's the way the entire banking and financial system operate. Interest rates are controlled, and interest rates, as you know, are not just the rate of return, they're a measure of risk.
There's no relationship between the risk and the interest rate.
Absolutely right. All those financial assets within the Chinese economy that are denominated in renminbi are artificially insulated from risk. And again, for that reason, it's very hard to understand the underlying value. Because a lot of people were shocked that China was able to manage its growth rate for a generation at over 8 or 9%. And there are many who called China's slowdown a long time ago. It didn't happen, but I think now there's a general acknowledgement that they're reaching a kind of saturation point.
And that's the centralized concern that I have long-term for China. They have such an investment overhang in these ghost cities. If they aren't successful in moving a worker, the average worker, into a middle-class wage, you are not going to occupy these cities, and that investment is going to completely go south.
That's right. Not only will all those stranded assets essentially be scrapped, but the main driver of the structural transition we spoke about at the beginning of our conversation, this shift from external demand and investment demand towards the consumer, is not going to have the momentum that it needs because income levels just won't sustain it.
And you can't run a country that size on minimum wage.
No.
It's impossible.
No, there has to be a middle class in China for its restructuring to succeed. There's a lot of optimism if you go into cities. You can see it. Spending is rising. Services are the fastest growing sector of the economy. But I think the jury is still out on the momentum of that process because it's not going as fast as people hoped that it would. And it does put a huge burden on the consumer because the global economy is basically stuck, you know. But right now, what's happening in that context is very interesting. It's as though the U.S. and China are both trying to avoid taking the blame for another global recession. We don't want to take the blame for taking down all these emerging markets.
And if the U.S. dollar strengthens anymore, it's only going to put the U.S. in a more difficult situation.
Absolutely. China is now been given the ball, and it's like, are you going to be the one who drops the ball? If their growth really begins to stall, then they may be the ones that end up being blamed. Low interest rates lead to bad credit allocation, and just basically the quality of credit can't remain that low without some consequences in the long run. U.S. rates have got to find their way back, but it's almost a trap right now. It's really hard to get out.
That's question.
Right. Yeah, when and what will be the consequences? It's really a complicated problem because it's not going to be easy for everybody when that happens, for sure.
Can we discuss the issues that are going on right now with the Chinese and their apparent aggression that is occurring in the South China Sea and the development of essentially reefs?
Right.
Islands that would normally...
They're building islands, right?
Yes, they're taking reefs that are submerged at high tide and trying to turn them into islands.
That's right. Yeah, this is actually a pretty long story, and that's why the name South China Sea was created. But it's taken on a new significance because of both China's initiative, shall we call it, for the moment, and also the U.S.'s desire to essentially reassert itself in the region, the so-called pivot strategy, right? So what we've got is essentially kind of a lukewarm spot that's becoming a hot spot. And it's a result of really both sides paying more attention to this area. But China has been by far the most ambitious. China is pursuing a very deliberate strategy of expanding its sphere of influence. I don't think even they would deny that. I mean, it's not reasonable to deny it.
It's very clear that
at the evidence. And it's printed right in their passports. Their passports have the map of China, which have the so-called 9-dash line. And the 9-dash line is a line that runs down to around the South China Sea, so that international water essentially belongs to China, or what would be seen as international water by the countries.
Really taking away free shipping channels.
Well, in principle, they could do that if they decide to essentially regulate movement there. If they're claiming that as their own maritime area, then they might have the impression that they can regulate the shipping. That would lead to problems. They claim these rocks or islands as their own, and that then entitles them to essentially enclose them. And if you take the union of all those little sets, like in a set diagram, then you've pretty much got the whole area, right? So China draws that line as their domestic maritime property, because it's an aggregation of all these little spots that they claim. Now, if you start with that premise, then of course establishing more of a presence in those areas is supposed to, would presumably raise the credibility of these claims. So China is essentially creating law by turning rocks into hard places and building what look a lot like military bases. I mean, they even deny that. They say that they're improving them for support of navigation and maritime
But they still
activities.
Have ports, they have helipads.
They have ports, helipads, and airstrips.
They're
definitely airstrips, yeah. They actually pretty closely resemble military bases. I'm not a military expert, but when I look at that, to me it looks like a landing strip. There aren't like luxury hotels or resort
There's no
around
economic activity going on.
Doesn't seem like that's the priority here.
Right.
So the question is, what are China's intentions? The new administration in China, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, basically they're represented by two guys at the top. And there are a lot of other new people, but those are definitely the leaders. They came into power at a time when there was also a leadership transition in Japan, when Abe came to power. And both of those leadership groups decided that they were going to use nationalism as a very big rallying tool. They wanted to essentially promote national identity as a way of strengthening their political position at home. And so came the first example of fighting over rocks or arguing over rocks in the ocean. These Senkaku Islands, or they have a Chinese name too, these are islands that are claimed by both Japan and China. Very clearly at that time, of a leadership transition in both countries, using nationalism and essentially confronting neighbors aggressively in the national interest was a big seller at home. It was very successful politically for both Abe and for Xi Jinping. In China right now, as you know, there's a big campaign against corruption, and that's a kind of a structural weakness in the Communist Party.
Yes.
They want strengths to offset that. Basically, nationalism has always been a very convenient political tool in order to divert attention, as you say, and also to justify sacrifice for populations. For them, asserting their presence in that region is legitimate. And this is the challenge, really, is to come to some mutual perception that allows for cooperation and avoids conflict. Because there's no way China will back down on these things, and we have to be realistic about that. But what we should do is pursue a strategy of securing this region for navigation and trade, where the, let's call them the security services of the US and China can essentially collaborate to deliver security. But unfortunately, China's kind of proceeding without consultation and without consideration, and that's arousing a lot of apprehension in the region. I don't necessarily think it's in their interest to be doing that, but they have to appease their own domestic audiences, and particularly the military. That's something that we don't think about in our everyday lives in the United States, because we have a competitive political system. But when you have a monopoly political system, then having a guarantor is relatively important.
Absolutely.
And that's why the current administration might be appeasing the Chinese military in this context.
David, the phenomena that's happening in the United States and Canada that's related to the real estate investment by the Chinese, it is so significant on our real estate market, potentially causing some bubbles in certain areas by overinvestment. Let's talk about that issue a little bit, and also think about how long do we think this trend is going to continue?
That's a very interesting development, Mary, and I think everybody, especially in California, is watching it very closely. It's a source of growth in the real estate industry, which has really startled a lot of people, because we're beginning to have, I think, a little bit of interest rate fatigue on the low interest front, and there was a lot of concern about capacity to find new demand, but suddenly it's appeared, of course in the tech sector, but also this influx of Chinese capital is really unprecedented. You probably recall that in the 80s, Japan, because of its sustained surpluses and growing wealth, became a big net investor, buying trophy assets in the US, including Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center. But actually the Chinese investment already is on a scale that far exceeds that. And in Canada last year, Chinese nationals represented 20% of all residential real estate purchases in Canada. It was a startling development. And California, I don't think that the US is, as a whole, is quite up to that level, but the Chinese are by far the fastest growing group of private and commercial real estate developers in the country. And what's happening really, it's important to recognize this, that there are two drivers in this case. The first one is wealth accumulation, savings accumulation, and the desire to find, basically diversify and buy new assets. But the second one is risk. This particular movement on this scale is clearly a response to a perception of risk in terms of the currency, in terms of the institutional framework, and in terms of the momentum of the overall economy. What we're seeing now is a massive hedging strategy among private Chinese individuals. It's going to go on as long as this uncertainty exists, and it's getting worse now with the constant downgrading of China's growth prospects. So I think that, frankly, we're at the early stages of this tsunami of investment from China into U.S.-based assets.
So if the continued devaluation of the yuan, that's going to encourage...
That will accelerate this process. Yeah,
yes, it will.
Yeah, it's technically almost illegal to be doing this because, as you may know, individual Chinese are only allowed to take out $50,000 apiece. But by devising ingenious mechanisms of group investment, they've been able to do this, and it's a booming activity. And there's no signs of it slowing down. On the contrary, I think it's going to accelerate unless China can overcome this risk perception problem.
David, thank you so much for your expertise, your explanations. This is such a complex situation, and you are able to capsulize it in information streams that we can understand, and hopefully help everyone understand investment decisions, finance decisions, and most importantly, just understand the world economy better.
It's been a great pleasure, as it always has been. I think you're doing a really important service to your clients by providing this kind of information. I always delight in talking about one of my favorite subjects, but frankly, better public information, and particularly better information for investors, I think will really help to advance these issues.
Thank you for watching On Point. If you have any questions, please feel free to call Mary at 530-272-7500 or email Mary at mary.owens@owensestateandwealth.com.